So a few weeks ago, Mark, I was walking through the airport and I came across this book, Tripped. It really caught my attention. I grabbed it, bought it, read it on the flight. It's about Nazi Germany, the CIA, and the dawn of the psychedelic age. Fantastic history about where LSD comes from. And I want to point out before we go any further, we're not here to talk about the recreational use of psychedelics. We want to talk about one key center point around what you and I talk about all the time, and that is machines don't fight wars, humans do, and they use their mind. And we get that from John Boyd. So our guest today is the author, Norman Ohler. He's here with us from Berlin today. We want to welcome him to No Way Out and get some great insights about not only his book, but his background in looking at things a little bit differently. His research also includes some look backs at Hitler and some potentialities there with different types of drugs. So Norman, welcome from Berlin. Hope you're doing well. And you've already met Mark. You've already met us. Just want to open up with you and turn it over to you and say any thoughts on your book. How well is it going? And let's start there.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on your podcast. I'm very happy to share some thoughts with you today. If we can come up with any, but usually our brain does. So let's just see where it goes. The book Tripped it's my, let me count, 7th book. 4 of them are in English, 1 novel and now 3 nonfiction books. And the book Tripped is a little bit of a special book because it has it comes from a personal story, which is a story within my family. My mother being sick with Alzheimer's disease, and my father and my mother and me and my sister also being somewhat helpless and how to treat this dreadful disease. And me personally, I have been interested in LSD actually for self-discovery, but also for recreational usage for quite a long time. But I became interested in the scientific or in the neurological aspects of it only recently, about 2 years ago, and I had read a study by an American startup company, Eleusis, that low doses of LSD might help against Alzheimer. And I showed this study to my father, who's quite a high judge in Germany. So for him, the idea of giving his wife an illegal drug is not natural. But he also found the study interesting, and he asked me if LSD is maybe a good medicine. Why is it not in the pharmacies? Very, rational question. And I said I will actually research this because I was also interested in the early years of LSD, like long before the 60s, when the illegal LSD scene exploded in America. I mean, LSD was a company product and was to be on the market as a mental health medicine. So what happened that it didn't, and that kind of sent me on my path. And then when I had researched the story, which is the book Tripped, I came back with it to my father, and he, being a former judge, always is convinced by a good story, because he says in a courtroom, you can't really know, usually you don't know what's the truth. You listen to the story, and the best, if the story sounds truthful or the story sounds right, and you believe in it and you follow it. And he thought that my story of LSD that I came up during my research in several archives in Germany, Switzerland, and America sounded right. And he actually decided to then discuss it with my mother, his wife, and they decided to then use LSD against her disease, and the results were and are actually quite good. And they're only the results within my family, but for me, at that point of writing the book, that was already something. That a book that I wrote had such a personal effect on very close people to me. So Tripped for me already is a success, even if no one would read it. But actually, also people read it, and I get even emails by other relatives of spouses of someone who has Alzheimer, for example, asking me, where can I get LSD, which of course I cannot supply because I'm a writer. I'm not an LSD chemist or distributor. But the communication with the readers is intense with this book, and in America, the resonance has been actually the biggest in all of the countries. And I think this is because America does have a huge mental health crisis, obviously. It also does have, particular groups of people, like a very large veterans movement, which, probably has a large uh, quantity of trauma problems, trauma diseases, where LSD might also help. So, and it also has a big hedonistic psychedelic scene, I would
Mhm.
imagine, because it is the largest Western country where these drugs have been used in the last decades, even though they are illegal. So for all of these reasons, the resonance in America, which is also probably the country that suffers the most from the war on drugs, being the country that invented the war on drugs,
Mhm.
this is it's the response has been quite good, and I'm very happy to engage with my American audience.
This is fantastic. Right now, I want to touch on a few points. Here in the U.S., the numbers are between 22 and 44 veterans take their lives every day, right, due to either mental health issues or something associated with that. That's just not good. What's happening as a result are that veterans are going overseas to take care of their PTSD, their TBI, their anxiety, their stress through the use of psychedelic assisted therapies, right? Because it's not legal here in the U.S.
Where do they go?
Uh, Overseas, that's all I can say right now.
Hmm.
Anywhere it's legal, there are countries where it is legal to use it or semi-legal to use it. We are seeing a resurgence, or not a resurgence, but a movement in the U.S. to legalize things like MDMA, potentially the legal, I believe ketamine is legal in some states. It depends on where you are, but this is exactly how we became aware of the psychedelic assisted therapy movement. Again, we're not promoting the use of the recreational use of psychedelics. I mean, that's not what we're here to talk about. We know that happens, but that's not what what we're aiming for at the moment. Um, so we do have that crisis here in the U.S. It's a full body crisis, either driven by the food we eat, the medicines that we're putting in our body, the SSRIs that are given out to by psychiatrists and psychologists to folks who are suffering through anxiety. The way we want to shape this, or I think we want to shape this now, is this war on drugs that you brought up earlier was a way for I'll just say an entity to suppress information or access to something that could provide people healing, right? And I do believe that we're going to see that happen again by other agencies or other organizations that are going to want to suppress information like this because it will affect their business. It'll affect the way they govern. It'll do so many things there. So there's a lot to unpack from this, including the story of your mother with Alzheimer's. We understand there's research going on that here as well. With the use of psychedelic assisted therapies, either ibogaine, 5-MeO DMT, LSD, psilocybin, and more. So, Norman, I don't know where you want to begin on that, but there's so many directions we can go. I just want to hear your thoughts on what I shared with you.
Um, well, when I was researching in the company archive of Novartis, which is one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, which bought Sandoz, which is the company that discovered LSD in 1943, I came upon one memorandum that was published in the early 50s by the discoverer of LSD, the chemist Albert Hofmann, in which he tries to convince, and I don't think this memo has ever been written about or seen. I just saw it among the piles and piles of papers that I examined. He suggested to the CEO of Sandoz, Atra Stoll, to transform the company of Sandoz into a pharmaceutical company that specializes in psychedelic medicines. So he said it's not only LSD. Um, and just if we stay with LSD, they still didn't know exactly what LSD was, how it could be used. It's a big topic. But he said beyond LSD, there will be many more molecules that will be beneficial to mental health, and we at Sandoz, we should really just go for it. We should specialize in this. We should examine all of this, and we should become the global leader in psychedelic medicine. And I mean, the idea is fantastic. It would have it would have created, a Microsoft of the psychedelic, of the pharmaceutical world. It would have been, it would have been a game changer. But to see, he basically said no to the memo and sidelined LSD and was going for different medications with some of them made a lot of money, a very profitable company. So the question is, did he make this only out of fiscal reasons? Like, did he really believe that this, we call them in German, psychopharmaka, I don't know how you say in English, psychopharmaceuticals, like SSRIs and antidepressants and all of these. Maybe he thought there's more money to be made in those than in the psychedelic medicines, because the psychedelic medicines, they have the tendency, they don't make you addictive. So as a producer, you lose that nice effect that the product you're selling to people will have to be taken every day for the rest of your life, for example, which is the case with some SSRIs. I know quite a few people actually who take SSRIs every day and cannot even imagine ever not taking them.
Right.
So this is great for a pharmaceutical company. So maybe the chemist Albert Hofmann, who was an idealist, I guess, because he had taken so many LSD so many times by then when he wrote this memo, like he was convinced that this is actually a medicine that can really heal people. So the question is, does the pharmaceutical industry really want to heal people? I had my car today. I picked it up from my car repairman, and I have an old Volvo, and it has over 300,000 kilometers. And because it's an old motor, and my repairman, who's also a friend of mine, he said they don't make these motors anymore because why would they? They make motors that are not as good, so people have to buy a new car every couple of years. Because he said my Volvo actually can run over 1 million kilometers, which is like more than 700,000 miles, which is quite a lot for a car, So the question is capitalism interested in the good of the people, or is capitalism interested in, making profit? Obviously, it's the latter. So the question is, do psychedelics have a chance in a capitalist society? I mean, this is one question that I find interesting. Then the other one is, of course, do governments want, because what happens with LSD basically, or with psychedelic medicines, is that they intensify your experience. They disrupt the ego. They give other parts of the brain more energy. So it creates, your brain runs differently. You think a little bit differently. You experience the world a little bit differently. You experience yourself differently. So these things are actually quite, you would imagine, healthy and interesting for a human being, especially the West. The West is built on the idea of freedom and of always going somewhere else and experiencing new thoughts. But maybe the government doesn't really want you to actually do that. So, maybe maybe there's two factors kind of limiting the thriving of the psychedelic pharmaceutical industry. It's one, maybe the profit, which just somehow doesn't add up, and number two, it's maybe the government makes it so difficult by prohibiting these substances that it's even impossible for the companies, even if they wanted to investigate it. So the psychedelics are in a really tight spot in a I don't know if we would call our democracies authoritarian, but they have this tendency that governments try to regulate people, even though they are democracies. So it's a problem of governance, and it's a problem of our economic system. That's why these psychedelics, I think, are in a tight spot, and that's really sad because we always want to have the optimized system for us humans, and we, in America, you always say America is the greatest country in the world, and many people actually believe that the system is the best, but it's obviously highly questionable. So the topic of psychedelics quickly becomes like a political topic.
Right. So let's go. So the war on drugs actually changed our orientation, our perception of psychedelics here in the U.S. We grew up. Mark and I grew up in the 70s and 80s, so we grew up in that war. So psychedelics bad. Don't even touch them. Don't ever do that. We know that to be true, right? That is the truth. That's a paradigm shift that we had to go through over the last several years. Now, back to your point about capitalism, and Mark can jump in here as well. Our society, I hate to say it, but is all about manipulation, right? Our food industry puts all kinds of chemicals in there to create some type of addiction. So you go back and get the potato chips or something else that isn't really good for you. I would say the same thing about farmers, and that's a good business model, by the way. Getting people addicted to something, including an iPhone, where you get a dopamine rush every time you get a ping. That's a good business model to create some type of addiction for your customers. The same thing is true with SSRIs. We create some type of addiction. You go watch American television and you're just overwhelmed with pharmaceutical ads about this new thing that takes care of something you didn't even know existed. And it has all these side effects, but you should probably take it, because you need to take care of this unknown disease that a small percentage of the population has. So that is a fantastic business model, as opposed to creating healthy people, right? And I think that's where you're going with this. Psychedelics can break addictions. We've seen this through opioid use, alcoholism, even nicotine addictions, right? So that is breaking those. We're seeing evidence that psychedelics can break those addictions. So that's not a very good business model for many organizations around the world, right? If those addictions are gone. So that suppression of information is critical to these organizations that we're looking at another war here potentially, where pharmaceutical companies influence the government to not allow access to psychedelic assisted therapies and other potential uses of them. So I agree with you there. Mark, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I always tread around the word capitalism because I think there's a capital C capitalism and a small c capitalism. And I think of small c capitalism, I think of flow, where people are free to exchange in peace. Some of the things that I've written about, where if I had a truly free market and people were truly free, it would be emergent. There would be signals to show that psychedelics, in fact, would be a benefit to society. And the capitalism large C, which is something more cronyist or mercantilist, where there's some kind of collusion between state and corporate bodies that ban these things that are basically they're creating an impediment to human excellence. Because I think what I hear Norman describing is that there's an opportunity for people to become more creative, collaborative, better off by exploring and expanding what it is that they're encountering in reality via psychedelics, or perhaps they're helping brothers and sisters of ours that we know that have received treatment from PTSD, women that have had postpartum depression, women that have had post assault trauma, things like that. There's a lot of different valid uses of these things, and to Norman's point, anything that's not addictive, whether it's breakfast cereal or anything else, they're not going to want to market. People aren't going to want to market that,
Yeah.
So I really empathize, but I think that really what it comes down to is, like, if the market were free, I think we're clearly getting signals that there is a price signal coming out to say that, yeah, hey, these are actually really good for humanity, and we should look into them.
So I'm curious to go back in time and go back into Norman's book, Tripped, about what was the original use from Nazi Germany. What in your book and your research? What did you see when you're in the archives and doing your research? What was the intent of using LSD and other and some pharmaceuticals out there by the Nazis? Norman?
Well, I mean, the Nazis were hugely into drugs, actually, which is what I researched in the book Blitzed. They were mostly into methamphetamine for the German army and into opioids. I mean, the leaders were into opioids, actually, to calm their nerves and create artificial charisma and coolness, I guess you could say. The psychedelic research it was not a major focus, and probably Hitler never heard about it, for example. But it was there was research going on in several concentration camps. The number one, for example, in Auschwitz there was psychedelic research, but I didn't find the documents. I'm afraid they are lost. But major research was also done in Dachau, which is the concentration camp close to Munich, which was conducted by the SS, by one officer, one doctor, an SS doctor called Kurt Plötner. He did the SS research in Dachau, and the headline of his research was basically mind control and the extraction of secrets. The Nazi regime, being a totalitarian regime, is by definition a paranoid system that sees enemies everywhere, and one has to know who belongs to us and who is the other that needs to be basically killed, or at least regulated, heavily regulated, punished if you were, the wrong other. For example, if you were a Jew or if you were a communist, that was a reason for you to be punished. But it's not so easy to see, who's what. And they had especially problems when they interrogated Polish resistance fighters after Germany invaded Poland. There was quite a bit of resistance in Poland, against this occupation. And even under torture, Polish resistance fighters didn't talk. And there's only so much torture you can do until the person is dead at the end, and then, some people just don't talk, or they say something that might not be true, just so the torture stops. So torture is not really a good way to find out the truth, but there's not many other ways. And then they had the idea that maybe through you give people drugs, and then they would speak the truth. That's like that was an original Nazi idea, and that idea, they tried to follow this idea when in 1943 the Swiss company Sandoz discovered LSD, and even though they didn't really understand what LSD was, what they did understand was that this is the most potent substance that works on the human mind, and this is still true today. LSD works in microgram dosages, not milligram, but microgram. So a tiny amount already has an incredibly strong effect on the brain, which is great for an intelligence service, or a service like, I don't know if service is the right word, like an organization like the Gestapo or the SS. Because if you have something potent in such small quantities, that's so easy to produce and easy to hide. And also LSD is odorless and tasteless, so you can slip like just one drop into the drink of another person. That person will never notice it, and suddenly has a very, very strong change of mind or effect in the mind. So that is interesting. That was interesting to the Nazis when they heard about this. I will come in a second to how they heard about this, because this is actually very interesting.
Right.
But once they knew that LSD is such a strong agent, they became interested in this type of research. They thought in interrogations, you could dose someone unwittingly and make that person insecure, like just, make the ego dysfunctional. Just what happens when you take LSD now, the ego gets, it changes, but if you take it willingly, obviously you know what you're doing, and you do it with a certain intent, of searching within yourself for an answer for something, for example. But if you get LSD without knowing, and then if the person who interrogates you is very clever, they thought maybe they can then, develop techniques on how they could actually make you so insecure, for example, that you spill the beans, or
Yeah.
They were interested in that angle.
Was there any evidence that they were successful with that?
Well, their findings were taken by the American forces that liberated the concentration camp. I think it was in April 1945, or maybe March. It was in the spring of 1945 when the Americans came into Munich, came into Bavaria, they liberated the camp, they found, they confiscated all kinds of papers because they were very interested in Nazi research, because Nazi research had this air of being, very good. There was actually a secret group coming with the U.S. Armed Forces, a part of the armed forces called ALSOS, and they had to investigate German nuclear scientists and also German biochemical scientists. So when they found these records, they took them and they sent them to their drug expert, and the army's drug expert, or the military's drug expert, was a Harvard professor called Beecher, and the Beecher studied these reports and wrote reports about the reports, which he called reports on ego-depressant drugs. And these reports were so interesting that actually the United States, the Central Intelligence Agency, which was founded in 1947, they landed on the desk of Sidney Gottlieb, who was an official there, and he was supposed to create this program and kind of finish the Nazi research, because the Nazis had just started. They had concluded, yes, you can make someone. They actually had concluded you can extract secrets, but they were just in the beginning. So it was promising to the Americans, to the CIA. So then the CIA developed the MKUltra program, which was really an expansion of that Nazi program, and really, tried to figure it out, whether you could develop LSD as a mind control weapon.
So, Norman, I was thinking as we were talking about how psychedelics were being used for mind control, but the discovery from the powers that be who were instituting or seeking them as mind control realized that these were mind liberating. And instead of mind control, the divulgence of secrets, we wind up with things like the Beatles and other stuff, that becomes very creative, almost like it freed the mind. Is that one of the things that you ran into? Is that maybe the mind control, they realized it wouldn't work for that, and it became too freeing and liberating for humans?
Yeah, maybe that's the irony of LSD, that it actually is the opposite of a mind control drug, because it has very different effects in the brain. It increases neuroplasticity, so it actually increases the ability of the brain to readjust to the challenges of the moment. Basically, the brain is constantly forming and reforming itself, and through LSD that process is enhanced. So it's like the opposite of a mind control drug. So in a way, the CIA went on the wrong Nazi path until at one point they realized that this point took them a few years, and hundreds, if not thousands, of people who were unwittingly dosed with LSD, American citizens who were just walking through Greenwich Village and meeting the wrong person, being brought into a so-called safe house, an apartment where they would then given LSD and observed from people behind a mirror and recorded and stuff like that. So that's how big the effort of the CIA was to exploit LSD as a mind control weapon, and in the end they found out it doesn't work. So what do they do then? Obviously they were ashamed because they also wasted a lot of taxpayers' money, and they had not even did it not work, it also had the effect that it got into the cultural scene and created was part of the creation of the counterculture movement of the 60s, which was a very anti-establishment movement. John Lennon, for example, said, "We have to thank the CIA. They gave us the LSD." I mean, they actually literally gave it to people. They, for example, gave it to the writer Ken Kesey, who then wrote the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and then stopped writing and bought a bus and drove with his bus and his friends across the country and distributed as much LSD as he could and called it the revolt of the guinea pigs. So it completely backfired what the CIA had in mind. So LSD is like it's not a good tool for the CIA. So what can they do? Basically, they can only illegalize it. Obviously, it wasn't the CIA that legalized it, but it was the American government. You could say probably it was President Nixon. I mean, it was during his tenure that LSD became illegal, and he thought that LSD is a bigger danger to the country than communism, basically.
Yeah.
It's like a lot of government programs that has the exact opposite effect of the stated intent.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Can you
so
go back to the safe houses? The safe houses, are they connected to what is known as MKUltra? Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the whole program was called MKUltra. It was initiated by the CIA director Alan Dulles, who called the Cold War, maybe rightly so, the largest challenge of the American government or military at the time. It was the confrontation with the Soviet Union. And he called it a brain warfare because it was a war of ideologies. It was communism versus free world. Use two terms, or West against East, or them against us. And there was the big fear that they would use mind control techniques already. They would, because American fighter pilots who were captured in the Korean War, some of them exhibited strange behavior after they were captured. Like in front of Chinese cameras, they accused the American government of biochemical warfare during the Korean War. So the response in America was, this cannot, they must have been brainwashed. Why would they say something which is obviously not true? Because America never said that they would use such weapons in the Korean War. So there was this fear that the communists are using mind control techniques, which they might have. There was never proof that the East and China or the Soviet Union experimented with psychedelics in order to create a so-called truth drug. But obviously, these were sinister entities, which and they probably did try to develop mind control. So it was kind of a reaction, or it was claimed to be a reaction to that threat that we, the Americans, must also develop mind control techniques. We must be armed against this threat. So this is MKUltra. This is the program that Alan Dulles invented. The CIA as director, and the man that was carrying it out was Sidney Bartley, who had quite a large effect on American history. And if you Google him, there's only like 2 pictures or something you can find online. So a very secretive man and a very secretive program within the CIA. Within the CIA, it was also secret. It was the need to know principle. Like who didn't have to know about MKUltra didn't know about it. Like it was not openly talked about. Even the fiscal aspect of it, like the financing of it, all that was kind of taken out of the usual budgetary processes. So it was quite secret, MKUltra. But it did exist, and one of the things it did focus on LSD, basically on mind control, how LSD could be abused. And one of the things Sidney Gottlieb came up with were these safe houses. The first one was on Bedford Street in Manhattan in 1951. I actually went to that house. It's a normal tenement house now. I wasn't able to get into the apartment, but the CIA rented 2 apartments that were they were touching each other, and then in one was were the investigators, and then the others were the LSD parties. And French Village was a so-called bohemian area, so they were like, kind of suspicious types anyhow, that were artists, Bob Dylan, I don't know, people who smoke weed and hang out in bars. And so it was like, the idea was, can we also kind of hack these people? Like, can we get on top of these people also? So they were, they hired a very special agent for this. His name was White. He was like a notorious FBN agent, Federal Bureau of Narcotics, who then worked for the CIA for the Safe House program. And he was a very colorful figure who also liked to take drugs, but he knew what he was taking. Obviously, if you take LSD, it's a strong effect. But if you give it to someone, as I said before, without that person knowing, it can be highly deranging, a highly deranging experience. So that's what they did. They went to bars, White, it's called White Horse Tavern, I think. It's one of the most famous bars in Greenwich Village.
Wow.
Invited people to parties, and obviously, if you're invited to a nice party in a nice apartment, maybe you would go, and then you would give an LSD.
Yeah.
So then they would, try to figure out how people change. There was one experiment they did. They had another pad, as they called it. It was called the pad in San Francisco, where the CIA employed prostitutes who would then give their clients LSD. I mean, these experiments sound kind of ridiculous, because what are you going to learn if you observe someone who sleeps with a prostitute? Compare that with someone who sleeps with a prostitute on LSD. I mean, what can you really learn from it? I think it was just, I think the fantasy of, they didn't learn so much. I mean, they
Yeah.
wrote it down, and it's ridiculous. I mean, it just shows you, I guess, the absurdity of, or the cruel. I guess it was also cruel, if you got drugged with a very strong psychedelic and then recorded, and
Yeah.
it's not nice. So I guess people had traumas from that, and later people said that they remember that 10 years ago they had a very strange night in Manhattan and San Francisco. They never really recovered from their bizarre experience. So it's highly unethical, and CIA never really found the way to control people, because it's very hard to control the human mind.
So MKUltra ended. Are we in the 50s or 1960s right now in the timeline?
Well,
roughly.
we started in the 50s.
Okay, and then ended
And
roughly.
It ended in the early 60s, and then LSD was prohibited in 66.
All right, now question. There's a person that starts to come into prominence here soon, and that's Timothy Leary. His background is kind of interesting. I don't think Mark knows this, but he was enrolled at West Point at one point, and then he's part of what I think he enlisted in the Army as well. So interesting connection there. But can you walk us through how Timothy Leary comes into play or into the big picture here?
Yeah, Leary was, as you said, a military man, I guess, but somehow he didn't stay with the military. But he was highly intelligent and went to Harvard. He was a professor. Like, he was described as a very square kind of guy, always buttoned up, and kind of boring professor. At one time, he was on vacation in Mexico, drinking rum with a friend, and then the friend said that he bought some magic mushrooms from an old woman or something in the village, and Timothy Leary was not that interested in it, because he probably didn't think so much would happen. Some old woman selling some dried mushrooms, and what can it be? Magic mushrooms were not known at the time. I mean, some people knew, but only like very few. The magic mushrooms had been discovered a little earlier by an American banker called Gordon Wasson, who was into mushrooms, and he was into all kinds of mushrooms, and he had found these magic mushrooms in Mexico. So there were a few people who knew about it. For example, a friend of Timothy Leary. So Leary took it, and he had a very strong experience. He called it the most spiritual experience of his life. He saw God, and he understood how everything's connected. He had a very spiritual, classical, religious awakening. So he changed, during this trip, and he thought that it was a good change, and that every person in the world must make that change, because we're all kind of alienated from nature and from each other and from God, which is obviously true. That's modern man and modern woman is alienated and therefore unhappy. So he thought if we all reconnect, and I think it's a good thought, but he was very very passionate about it. So first of all, he started doing research at Harvard University with the students, which in the beginning was accepted because it was a psychology professor. So, it was unusual work, but no one really thought it was weird. But then the lectures turned into kind of parties, sometimes at his house, and he was also connected to sex. Like he also said it liberates you sexually. So this more and more people got very skeptical of what's happening at Harvard University. And probably there were some ethical, lines that Leary was blurring because he was always convinced that the bigger picture is so important that we all get turned on by psychedelics and we all change and all the wars in the world will stop and become peaceful human beings. So it's a very naive conception of psychedelics, but it's also it's not totally unusual to have that reaction. I don't personally think that LSD makes people better, but he actually thought it will make people better / more empathetic towards other people. So he really took it to the extreme, turned on his students, probably encouraged them to take psychedelics. So at one point, Harvard leadership fired him, which was the first time, I think, in the 20th century that Harvard actually fired a professor. And he was a very popular professor because he gave people very strong drugs, which also they are interesting, if you take these drugs. So he had a following. It became like a cult. So Leary and many other LSD researchers and psychedelic researchers criticized Leary for being too careless about it, too flamboyant about it. I guess his style was not to everyone's liking. Probably today, my daughter probably would say he's a bit cringe, So, yeah, but he was, he was also charismatic, and I think what he did in a way is amazing. Not amazing, but it is, it's noteworthy, but maybe he actually did, make more damage than good. It's hard to say. I mean, he was considered by Nixon the most dangerous man in America because, he tried to turn on everybody with LSD. And he was also smoking weed, which was considered very bad at the time. It was not legalized in many states, or in some states as it is now. He was actually sentenced to, I think, one time, something like 17 years in prison for having a little bit of weed in his car.
Yeah.
So the government actually went after him also, and he spent quite a bit of time in prison. He escaped from prison once. He was helped, I think, by could have been the Weatherman, which was like a terrorist organization in the United States. So then he fled to it was in Africa where the Black Panther headquarters were. He fled. It was in Algeria, so he stayed with them, and he pissed them off too because he was always talking about drugs, and they were into the socialist revolution, so they didn't really. They thought, that drug taking is actually counter-revolutionary. So Leary was a powerful figure. I think he's a very interesting person, and he's closely connected to LSD, but that's what most people think. LSD equals Leary's, flamboyant way to treat it, which is,
he a diversion?
A very.
He could be a diversion.
Do you think he's a diversion to like the core concepts to just make it look like there's this quacky professor? But
he's a bit quacky, and then some people said he was actually then an agent at one point. I don't know if that's proven. I mean, he used to threaten with like life sentence in prison, and then something that was changed. So I guess I don't know. I mean, I'm not a Leary expert, so I don't know. Did you ever look
into Chaos by Tom O'Neill about the Manson family, and they were talking about a similar situation that you described in Greenwich Village happening in San Francisco in the Haight-Ashbury district, which there was another cultural renaissance with things like the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane that everybody came out of.
Well, I think there's an interesting connection about the Grateful Dead and the Bear, right? Am I saying his name right? The Bear?
Yeah, it's the Bear. Well, yeah, I mean, Manson obviously is going to be starting LSD chapter because I guess the Manson murders happened on LSD, and they were like a LSD cult, so like all the prejudices you could have against LSD kind of manifest in Manson and these horrific things that they did. The Bear is a different story. I mean, the Bear is the Bear because when Sandoz, the Swiss company, was not allowed to produce LSD anymore, and there was still a huge demand for LSD, illegal chemists or chemists who had to make it legally, and the bear was one of them. The first one was actually the son or the grandson of the Kentucky governor, Stan Owsley III. He claimed that his girlfriend was a chemist, and he just looked it up in the library, like in the local library, how to make LSD. So making LSD is not that hard. It's not easy. Like you need, it's not easy, but you can do it. If you're a chemist, you can do it. You don't need to. You can do it in an illegal lab. Let's put it that way. So some people, took on the job, and the bear was one of the earliest LSD chemists, and his way of distributing it. He didn't make it to make money. I mean, I think he gave away every other trip, and I think one trip was $1. So he made it basically to make it available for many people. And it's like an ideological, like a reason. He was like an idealist, you could also say.
But his
And he was
distribution network was pretty amazing, though, right? That's
Yeah, I mean that was the smart distribution network, replacing that, which was a very popular band at the time, I guess, and they found concerts being happenings, and so they used that distribution channel because he used the sound. He became the sound man, one of the sound engineers of the Grateful Dead.
They created the
Also
wall of
created
sound. That was their
he
big.
created the wall of sound.
And he
Yeah,
designed the Steal Your Face emblem.
yeah,
I wonder, like, Grateful Dead is an interesting study because they took a completely differentiated approach to the marketing of music, and it was more of a free market system. That's true. There was a lot of peripheral things around that they're known for, but I wonder if that creativity that they had maybe came from some of the use of psychedelics and the not only
Well, I
freeing
mean,
your
they
mind,
used,
but freeing their
yeah.
business policies. They allowed people to record music. I mean, they did so many unconventional things. If there's a connection.
Yeah, I mean, I think LSD also, in a way, can be a capitalist tool, like if you describe it with a small c, because it does create, ideas of networking and sharing, or it does, support these ideas. And this is, how we all thought, maybe capitalism might evolve when the internet came about, and it was all about, sharing economy, and but also the 90s that saw the rise of the internet, saw the rise of the giant corporations, which is kind of the opposite. So these two faces of capitalism kind of stare at each other, maybe. Totally agree. And the LSD or the Grateful Dead model of distributing music and pharmaceuticals, in this case LSD, is very different from the corporate model of distributing music and pharmaceuticals.
in your book, you bring up
Yeah.
Mary. I'm gonna get her name wrong. Mary Pinchot. Am I saying it right? Or Pinchot?
I heard it's pronounced
Mary
Pinchot.
Pinchot Meyer.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. What's the connection there to John F. Kennedy? If you can cover that for us.
Well, they seemed to have been lovers. At least she was in the White House quite a lot, so she was a very intimate friend of his. I mean, a very preferred friend. So it was not like he had many lovers, and one of them was Pinchot. She seemed to have been like Pinchot connection to JFK, as they, for example, were seen smoking weeds together in the White House, and then it is a fact that Pinchot Mayor actually had a meeting with Leary, and because Leary was so famous and she wanted to get LSD, like the best food LSD, for an influential friend, as she said to Leary, Leary immediately became very interested and wanted to join in, but she said, no, I'm going to do this alone with my influential friend, and she didn't say JFK to Leary, and she might have written it into a diary, but her diary was taken because she was also assassinated. A few months after JFK was assassinated, she was assassinated, and the same day her diary was taken, removed from her apartment in Washington, D.C. So she received LSD in April 1963 from Leary for this influential friend. She had a few influential friends. She was like a socialite in Washington, D.C. So it's not proven that she meant JFK. It could have been someone else. But JFK then meets her. I mean, they did meet after she received the LSD from Leary. So yeah, it's time to write it. I'm not sure if they have this shades of perspective. Please have that should simple. Day 63 or in summer 63.
Yeah.
And if you listen to that speech, there's different recording you could find online. You will be a bit surprised by JFK's peacenik kind of lingo, where it says like basically, well, brothers and sisters, and we all live on the same planet, and the Russians are also humans, and we should stop the stupid arms race. And, that's ridiculous. It's a pissing contest. He doesn't say the word pissing contest in the speech, but they've put in show play. She said to JFK, "Stop the pissing contest with the Russians. What's going on? We're wasting billions of dollars for arms and creating these, monsters. Why? It's not necessary. We're wasting so many resources." And he basically addresses that in that speech that he gives at the American University. And obviously, that could be one of the reasons, his change of mind that leads to his assassination, which is, of course, is also speculation because we don't have any proof that the killers thought that this man has to be stopped before the arms race is over. But it is interesting. So it's just like another layer of the JFK narrative that comes into play when we think of LSD also being.
It's an enigma wrapped in a conundrum.
Yeah.
But to the point, Oliver Stone uses that actual speech as part of his film JFK to talk about that, and Pinchot Meyer's husband. I was going to say Pinchot Meyer's husband was also in the CIA.
Yeah,
Lord Meyer.
I know that. All right.
Yeah, but they were separated already, so she might really have hated, her going to him. I mean,
I had read that she and Kennedy had known each other since their board school days because the Pinchot family was a prominent family. They'd been governor of Pennsylvania and a cabinet secretary and all this. So there was some, upbringing familiarity. But
all right, the next characters are Nixon and Elvis. I read about that. We grew up around Elvis when we were a little bit younger. Our parents followed Elvis, and we know how he died, which is often made fun of. But can you walk us through the relationship there? What happened with Nixon and Elvis?
I mean, it's just a little side story actually, but it's kind of sheds some light on the ongoings, I think. I mean, Nixon received a very strange letter by Elvis that he had written in the first class of an American Airlines plane, where he says, and the handwriting, I looked at the notes, handwriting is very shaky, which is maybe connected to the plane's movements, but maybe not, maybe it's connected to his pill taking. Presley was taking a lot of medicines, which were all legal medicines, of course, not drugs. So he writes in this shaky handwriting that he wants to be an anti-drug agent for the American government. He wants to meet Nixon. He would be able to penetrate, basically those drug taking hippie-esque music circles like the Beatles. There was one meeting between Elvis Presley and the Beatles that they didn't really vibe, as you would say today. Like, I guess it's like John Lennon made fun of him or something, and Presley was really pissed at that. So for him, these were like European leftists who came to America, made a lot of profit, corrupted the American youth, and then went back to England, something like that. That's what he said to Nixon, actually. So Nixon, Nixon had the advice by his advisors that he should mix more with the cultural scene of America. So he thought when Elvis sent him this note that he should invite him to the White House, and this was like probably one of the weirdest encounters in the White House. There's photos of it where you see like Elvis Presley with a thick belt and his coat and sunglasses, and he's smiling because he's like high on antidepressants and for making pills, and shaking Nixon's hand. He's probably also high on the same pills, so they like shake hands and talk bullshit, basically talk about nothing, and how we get the American youth to be healthy and not corrupted by this weed and by this LSD and all these dangerous things. Maybe they had a whiskey together also, I don't know. And Elvis gave him a World War II Colt, that like a weapon, like a Colt, I guess you say.
Right.
It's a pistol, or is that a
Well,
different
it's a
thing?
pistol.
It's a pistol, right? So, as a present, it's much flattered that basically they talked about nothing, and then but Presley said, "I want to be a DEA agent. I want to rat on my fellow musicians." Basically, he said that. And Nixon was a little bit, taken. Like he didn't really know how to react, and he kept on saying, "Let's just make sure you don't lose your credibility, and maybe you do an anti-drug song," which Presley thought was a good idea, and they thought about a recording place for this anti-drug song, when it's suggested Presley to record a song called "Get High on Life." It's funny, It's
Yeah.
if you turn into a movie, that would be a funny scene. Obviously, Nixon and Presley. I mean, it's very sad because I was a big Elvis fan when I was a kid. I grew up in West Germany. We had a lot of Americans in our hometown, American soldiers.
Right.
Elvis Presley was a soldier in the 50s, I think, in Germany.
Right.
In Bad
In
Nauheim.
Grafenwöhr.
Yeah, Siberia.
Yeah.
So like that
Do-
whole
do you
American
think-
soldiers.
Do you think, so I'd been to Graceland with my boys a few years ago, and I never knew this about Elvis, but he was he was a very serious reader, that he would travel with trunks of books and he would consume all these things. He was very much an interdisciplinary autodidact. And a lot of the books that I saw there and that were on display with his underlining and marginalia, a lot of them had to do with sort of the topic that we're talking about, that LSD would create interest in, like that your creativity and everything is within you. So a lot of Eastern philosophy, a lot of Hindu, Buddhism, and
Elvis.
that's Elvis. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's weird. I mean, why was he so close against that idea?
I don't know. Or is it another diversion that maybe he really wasn't? Because I had never heard that about him, that that Eastern philosophy was a very you've seen like the Elvis karate things, but it's kind of a cartoon version of Elvis. But in reality, that he had a very deep interest in Eastern philosophy, and he studied it in depth. And in the museum, they have, again, all these underlined books like Kingdom of the Mind and Seth Speaks and Khalil Gibran and all these other things that were Elvis would travel with trunks of books.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting.
It's possible that the meds that he was taking suppressed that access to what he was reading, right? And I think that happens quite often, in today's society. So
I mean, the meds are a fact. I mean, it's been killed in Rome.
Yeah, so it did kill him in the end. Okay, there's a couple of other questions I have here. There's a connection. So we have Hoffman. We have April. I think it's April 19th, 1943. It's Bicycle Day. I think quite a few people know that. There's a connection to the author of Brave New World in the timeline as well. And I think Brave New World was written before the discovery of LSD. But what is that connection between Hoffman and Huxley, if there is one?
They became like pen pals, I think is the word, which is an interesting word because we don't write letters anymore, but they were writing letters to each other. And Huxley started with mescaline, so this also Dorset perception that was written before LSD, because mescaline is an older, it's a natural hallucinogenic that people used before LSD was discovered. And Huxley was one of the first Western writers. I mean, he's British, but he lived in the United States. And he was looking at trying to describe what happens in the brain, what happens in the head, what happens in regards to mental health when taking psychedelics. Like he was saying that the doors of perception open and you have more perceptions than you usually have. But he went into detail. So when he heard of LSD, he became very interested in LSD. Also, he experimented with LSD to experiment to figure out what's different about it, and he wrote about it. Actually, when he died, and he died of cancer in the last hours of his life, when those were happening to him, he demanded of his wife to inject him LSD, so he wanted to be as conscious as possible in the moment of his death, because he was also into Eastern philosophy, and Tibetan Buddhism, for example, teaches you that you should be as conscious as possible when you die, because then your mind is able to go into the other world and reincarnate or become one with the light. While if you're like dozed down and you're kind of intoxicated in the opposite way, let's say by alcohol or by a downer or by an SSRI that closes you, and then it's not good if you die this way. It's good as a human to die as conscious as possible. Death is not something to be afraid of, but it is a transformation.
Yeah.
So he was really convinced, and that is like a basic principle of spirituality, that death is not it's not bad, but a transformation. It's just a change.
If I understand
so
correctly, Norman, I believe that some type of DMT, like a 5-MeO DMT, is released when we die, and if we're under the influence of, like you said, SSRIs and alcohol, then we don't have access to them. It may be true. I'm not sure, but that's what I understand.
think
we do have that access through like a DMT that's natural in our body. Have you tracked any of that?
Well, it seems to be true that DMT is released. I don't know if it's not released. People have taken a lot of SSRIs, and what that means. I'm actually not an expert in that.
Well, we have some folks coming on that could answer that, so I'll write that down as a question for them.
For sure.
I just thought about that now, but based on what you were bringing up there, like there may be a connection. We'll ask the researchers on that down the road. Anything else on what's next for you after Trip? Are you going to look more into psychedelics, or what's your next phase of your profession?
I would like to write more on drugs, but I'm not only writing on drugs. My next book is actually a book about a skiing vacation with my daughter in Davos, Switzerland, which is called The Magic Mountain. And The Magic Mountain being a famous novel by Thomas Mann, which came out 100 years ago, where Thomas Mann kind of examines the end of modernity and what kind of world are we giving to our children. So I kind of wrote a prequel to that, because during the skiing vacation with my daughter, a lot of I was writing, she was skiing, and I wrote about that experience. It's a completely different book. It's what I did, all a fictional book that I was working on. And that's coming out now in Germany in September, and hopefully in America also next year.
So you brought
it's just finished now.
Great. So on the topic of skiing, and I'm going to try to make a connection here back to psychedelics. One of the reasons I like to ski is it gets you into a flow state. You have to be present, right? And if I understand psychedelics correctly, it has a similar effect. It reduces that ego, allows you to reconstruct some things in the past. So to me, and we're seeing connections between flow states and the use of psychedelics assisted therapies. Can you comment on that?
Well, I can comment on the flow state of skiing. And the flow state of psychedelics is, what it's all about and the trip. But the flow state of skiing is also interesting. I had a very traumatic experience in my life once, and I don't need to explain now what the trauma was, but it was a very heavy trauma. And it only resolved when I was skiing, because when you're skiing, you can't think about your trauma. You actually, you are flowing, and you have to be so much in the moment. It's the same way with surfing. I heard people say the same about surfing. It could be with many sports that you get into a flow state. But with skiing, it certainly works. I guess skiing on LSD should be great.
I don't know if I want anybody to do that, by the way. That's, maybe
We're not endorsing that.
Yeah,
We're not recommending that.
Yeah, we don't want you to do, but I think the overlap is there. And for those that are not interested in psychedelics, that's fine. There are other modalities, other ways you can get to a similar state. And that's what I understand. So skiing, prayer, meditation, yoga, I believe there's overlap between all of those. And if I understand it correctly, things like LSD, ibogaine,
Also,
ayahuasca, they can accelerate that experience for you.
also lovemaking can be a thing that puts you in a flow state. That's why I was
Yes.
interviewed about JFK and LSD, and then and I said at the time that it was on TV, American TV, and I said at the time that maybe it was also just the lovemaking between Pinchot and JFK that changed him, because that can also be transformative, I guess.
Thoughts on that, Mark?
Well, I had read the book Mary's Mosaic about Pinchot Meyer and her assassination and what led up to it, and it was sort of an intersection of a couple of books. One was JFK and the Unspeakable by James Douglas, about some of his influence that moved him to peace. But
Yes.
I think what I understand of Pinchot Meyer was more of like a soulmate with JFK, like a they did have some kind of a conscious connection beyond, she wasn't like a mistress to him, like that she was some kind of someone that gave him a lot of elevated thinking or whatever, and maybe it did have something to do with psychedelics. But it is funny how those things kind of weave together. But then you bring in the CIA. Her husband, or her estranged husband, or whatever he was in the CIA. Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah, if I would make a movie about JFK, I would probably make a movie about JFK show.
Mhm.
That connection is like the most interesting thing.
Yeah.
Well, Norman, I want to thank you for coming on. The book is Tripped. Again, I came across it at an airport, read it on a flight. A fantastic read for anybody who's listening to the podcast. And I'm going to turn over to Norman to see if you have any questions to us, Mark or I, about anything we cover here on the podcast.
Oh, I'm good. I mean, I'm gonna listen to your podcast from now on, because I hadn't
Thank you.
done
Thank
that
you.
before, and I think it's very interesting to talk about flow and some of the other ideas you have started to mention in our talk. So thank you very much for having me and connecting, and hopefully we'll stay in touch.
I appreciate it.
Absolutely.